So let's get started. The topic of the class is Introduction to Network Science. In particular, we're going to be talking about social network analysis and how it is used in practice. And we're going to talk about various techniques and methods and applications of social network analysis. Just to remind you, this class is being taught at Computer Science Department, and so it means it's going to be technical, and it's going to be hands-on class, which means you guys will have to write some code and write programs and experiment with the data. So this is a plan. So 2 instructors. It's a 1-module class. We'll have 10 lectures and 10 seminars or labs, and there will be 4 homeworks through the course. At the end, we'll have a final exam. So far, the schedule is Fridays, 6:10 to 9 p.m. We have a website, and on that website, you will see all the materials that are presented in the class. So there'll be lectures there, and the video recordings from the lectures and slides. And also, there will be a link there to the site with materials for homeworks. Now, feel free to always contact us. Here are the emails, and Ilya is in class right now, so if you need any help. All right. All right, you guys very quiet. Okay, doing okay? Okay. All right. So we didn't list a lot of prerequisites for this class. I would call it helpful background. And that means, that's really helpful if you do know material from these courses. We're going to be using discrete mathematics. We're going to be using a little bit of linear algebra, a little bit of probability theory, a little bit of differential equations, a little bit of algorithms and data structures. Now, I don't expect you to be experts, of course, in those fields, but it would be good if you remember certain basic notations, like sort of what matrix is, what vector is, what probability means. Some basic facts, they will be very, very helpful. All right. Now, if you feel uncomfortable sometimes with some of mathematical sides of the lecture, again, feel free to contact us. We'll try to help. Now, programming experience, again, is not required, but welcomed. We're going to be using R programming language, and in particular, we're going to be using RStudio to do programming. And we're going to be using particular libraries. It's called iGraph, and most of the computations will be done in iGraph. So, for you, programming will be mostly scripting, so putting together calls to different functions. And we're going to be doing some visualization, and that's going to be done in iGraph or in a standalone program called Getty. Textbooks. There are actually several very good books out there that I strongly recommend. So the first book is this Network Science book by Albert Laszlo Barabashi. It's a brand new book, 2016. And in fact, chapters from that book are available online from his website. And on our class site, there's a link to his site, or just Google it. Another very, very good and interesting book is Networks, Crowds, and Markets. That book has been out there for a few years. It's written by David Easley is an economist and John Kleinberg is a computer scientist. So there's a mixture of economics and computer science in that, but it's actually a very, very good presentation. The book Statistical Analysis of Network Data with R. This is actually a very thin book, but it's practical. It's actually one of the authors here, Gabor Sardi. He's the author of this iGraph package we're going to be using. And so this book, the third book, has a lot of examples on actual practical usage of that package, right? And some analysis of the networks with R. And in fact, the goal of this class is eventually so that by the end of the class, you can actually take a network and analyze it, right? And the last book shown here, this is sort of the classic of social network analysis, big fat book by Stanley Westerman and Catherine Foss. This book for those who is really interested in learning more about the theory of social networks. But I would say, out of these books, this one I would definitely recommend you to read. And lectures, you will sometimes notice that lectures and follow the chapters in the book. So what's the plan? First of all, today we're going to talk about introduction to network science. And we're going to talk about like sort of what network science is, where it came from, what kind of problems it solves, and we mostly look at different examples. So it's sort of infotainment class. But then starting next week, we'll jump into more serious stuff, and we're going to talk about descriptive network analysis. We're going to talk about statistics and the metrics that can be used to learn about networks. Week 3, it's mathematical models of networks. So we're going to learn about different models, how to model the network, and it's mostly generative models, which means these are the models that can generate networks. Week 4 is about properties of nodes within the networks, so the importance of the nodes, and that is not centrality and ranking. So, who is important within the network and how to find those important nodes and people. Week 5, lecture 5 would be about network communities. So we're going to talk about what community is and how to find who's in network. Networks, lecture 6 about network structure and visualization of networks. So we're going to talk about ways to visualize network and sort of learn more about its structure. And then we switch to like additional topics that are more about the processes that happening on the network. So one of the very good examples will be epidemics. So we'll talk about epidemics and actually information spreading on the network. So how rumors spread around and sort of Twitter operates, etc. We're going to talk about diffusion of innovation. That's just a little bit twist to the economics, but that's really also about sort of diffusion and spread of information. But there's some very interesting models out there. Week 9, we're going to be talking about strategic network formation, and that is ways and how and why networks are formed, especially from the point of view of economics, from the point of view of utility theory. And week 10, that's sort of additional lecture, we're going to talk about what's called spatial models of segregation. That's a very applied topic, quite interesting, especially if you are into urbanist studies and thinking about cities. So that's the plan. We might make certain changes as we go. It really depends on sort of the feedback we get from you and how well we proceed. But that's for right now the plan for the next 10 lectures. All right. Any questions? No questions. Okay. Should I speak slower, faster, louder, quieter? Up? All right, guys. If Ilya Andreevich, can you just push the sound up, because I probably cannot speak louder than this, but you can make sound louder. Okay, so network science. Well, network science as a science has been forming within the last several, I would say 5-10 years, and it has different sources. And actually, in fact, because it comes from sort of as a joint from different sciences, it actually quite often carries even different names. So first of all, the source is, of course, sociology, right? And sociology usually refers to this as social network analysis. And if we start tracing back into the field of sociology, back to like 1930s and 1940s, when people first started looking into connections between actors, and sociologists call this actors, and how they interact. But of course, the main interest in social networks happened in sociology around 1970s. And so that's probably the oldest sort of science that has been looking onto network analysis. Then, of course, mathematics. Now, in mathematics, people call networks graphs, and there are a lot of studies of graphs in mathematics, and in particular, the topic was popular in 50s and 40s and 50s. I would say even 60s, when Erdős and René was in famous Hungarian mathematician Erdős was building a theory of random graphs. Computer science usually also operates with the terminology graphs. Sometimes networks, but computer scientists, when they say networks, they quite often refer to computer networks. Overall, from theoretical computer science and sort of algorithmic perspectives, it's about graphs, and there is usually problems of like shortest path, breadth first search, etc., etc., etc. So computer science brings a lot of technology into this, right? And then there is other sciences, like for example, there is statistical physics that talks about networks, and usually call this field complex networks. And the reason is because those networks have very complicated structure, and physics, well, is usually interested in studying like complex objects, and that's sort of the field that draw attention from physicists. But honestly, physicists jumped into the study of networks only like around the year 2000, right? Maybe late 90s. So they're quite late into the game, right? Then economists and economics, it's also about networks, and that's your sort of flow of money networks, financial networks. You could probably put also in there logistics and all the delivery networks, etc., etc. Finally, there are quite a few contributions in the science coming from bioinformatics people, and usually talk about biological pathways, but it's again networks. Only the actors or the nodes on the networks are usually sort of either chemical substances or maybe something else, but the idea is the same. You have interacting objects that connected, and they form a network. So depending on where the particular algorithm is coming from, it might carry different name, right? So you will hear networks and graphs used interchangeably. Just be aware that that's exactly the same object, right? And we're going to sort of look at different examples right now and see what I actually mean. So again, sort of terminology. Network and graph, the same thing. Nodes and vertices, that's again the same objects. In social sciences, that's going to be actors, right? So this is a node or vertex. Now we're talking about nodes connected by links, and links are also called edges, right? So here is, here's an edge connecting two nodes, right? Here's another edge, etc. So we call them links or edges. Again, if you look at the social science literature, it's going to be relations. And I can keep going, right? In terms of like sort of equivalence of the terminological terms. Again, the reason there are so many terms is because network science as a science is just forming, and it's forming from very different fields of study, and so each field brings in its own terminology, right? So honestly, even like by reading it like a paper, even without looking deep into the content, by just looking by the definitions and terminology they use, you can actually tell what field of study these people are coming from. So without further ado, let's just look at a few networks, and that should give you an idea, like an understanding what we're going to be doing. So this is a very simple visualization of a social network, of actually Facebook network of a particular person. By the way, while we're looking at this visualization, also keep in mind that this is a teaching process, and it's a learning process. Look how visualizations are done, right? Notice how authors of this visualization use colors, shapes to present the information, because later on in the class, you will have to show and present the networks, right? And so this is a sort of good examples to copy from. So in particular case right here, this is actually the author of this graph, right? Of this picture. It's sort of egocentric. That's her, right? And the size of the nodes are proportional to the number of connections or proportional to the number of friends, direct connections from that node. And because that's sort of her network, her egocentric network, right? So, she has the largest size in here because, for everybody else, we cut out connections to the rest of the world, right? So her size is the largest. Now, it is color-coded according to different types of connections, right? Or groups that people belong to. Like, for example, the pink here is family, and there is students, and there's neighbors, and there's sort of high school friends, et cetera, et cetera. So in fact, it's not very easy to draw this type of picture, and I'm showing it because it's actually a very good example where this groups of nodes or clusters has been pushed out, so you can actually see them, right? When you start drawing networks yourself, you realize that not every algorithm does it, right? And so it's actually well done here. Here's another example. This is Facebook communities. Again, some communities are color-coded. And one thing to notice here is that sort of the community, right? The community is a group of nodes that are more tightly connected among themselves than with the rest of the network, right? And so when we start talking about community detection, we're going to be talking about algorithms that would allow us to detect these groups of nodes. Now, they're nicely color-coded on this slide, so you can just sort of visually notice them. But in order to color-code them that way, we first have to detect them, right? And so the algorithm will actually detect them, and then you give this information to a drawing algorithm that will color them. So that's the sort of the logic of the process. Moving forward, this is yet another egocentric network. This is from LinkedIn. They used to give access to an app that will actually visualize your social network. I'm not sure if they're doing it, if they're still doing it. Again, it's egocentric because the person, and I suspect that's maybe even my network. So the person is in the center, sort of, and that's his connection and his friends. And again, if it's LinkedIn, it's most likely you get people again from school, from university, and from different jobs you had. Now, notice that communities or groups of nodes that are tightly connected, right? There is a lot of connection among them, but they're also connected to the rest of the graph. So they're not just sort of separate. Because if they're separate, that's a trivial task to find them. What's much harder is if they're still connected to the rest of the world, but there is a higher density of the nodes and higher density of connections among them. This is sort of another cool network that shows a spread of obesity on a large social network. This is the network, the nodes are people. They're color-coded. Yellow are bees, and green non-obese, and the connections are either family connections or friends. And that sort of the point of this slide is in the longitudinal study, the scientists showed that obesity is actually can spread as epidemics, right? So if you have all obese friends, there is actually a pretty high chance you're gaining weight, right? So it's not only about your genes. It's also about people who surrounds you, right? It's a behavioral property. Here's another wonderful picture. It's actually high school, one of the U.S. high schools, romantic or sexual networks, right? So pretty much it's dating network, males, females. I especially like the circle in the center. So that's, different datings and with anonymous questionnaire, who, dated whom. So that's sort of another example of a social network, right? This is a beautiful network and actually beautiful visualization. It is a concurrence, co-authorship of people on various in documents of International Committee on Intellectual Corporations, right? Again, this is actually a very big network, and the author of visualization did a terrific job, color coding, scaling it, and positioning nodes such that the network is actually readable. I'm not sure how well you can see it right now on a screen. I will make the slides available. Take a look. It's actually quite interesting how things are organized within the network. And of course, the nodes are there are signs at the node, so you know what the node is, right? This is a pretty cool network. It's well, now it's almost more than 10 years old. But this is a network of blogs, and this is conservative blogs versus liberal blogs, and the way they're connected. So red is conservative, blue is liberal, and the connection, the edge here means citation. One blog cites another blog, and so you notice that, of course, conservative cites conservatives. Hello? Are you guys still there? Hello? Okay, please let me know if you cannot hear me. So conservatives are red, liberals are blue, and if you notice, the conservative blogs only refer to conservatives, liberals mostly to liberals, right? Democrats to Democrats, conservatives to conservatives. There is some sort of refers, but very, very little. And there is a property of the network that's called associative mixing, and that's sort of what we see here. Couple more slides. This is an example of Twitter and how information spreads on Twitter. And this is what's called hashtag diffusion. And we see how people retweet things or mention things. If you use Twitter, there are two ways to share and spread information. And you notice that it's usually sort of one person has a lot of listeners and just sends it to a lot of people. This is, again, sort of old news, but also very nice visualization of the Twitter. The news about when Bin Laden was captured, so how it originated from two sources and then has been retweeted through the rest of the sort of Twitter universe. Yet one more example of the network. This is a social network of emails. So when Enron, and that's energy trading company, collapsed many years ago, because it was a federal investigation, the emails were used in court and they were released to researchers, and sort of researchers got access to this huge body of corporate email communications, and so they were able to map out communications between top officers within the company, right? And actually, in fact, in the center, there is this CEO of the company and sort of other officers, and the size of the node here is, again, the volume of communication, and edges are communications between two nodes, and the thickness, so the intensity of the communication. So we know that, like, for example, there's been a lot of conversations happening there, right? And again, the map is zoomable, so you can actually see exactly who is talking to who and how much. Yet another example of the network. Now it's financial network. So we can actually see here existing relations between various financial institutions. And a relation means, in this case, it means one financial institution borrows money from another financial institution, or gives money to another financial institution. And so of course, you see familiar names here, like Citigroup, like Citibank, that also present in Moscow, right? There is a now infamous Deutsche Bank, and I mean, a lot of a lot of banks. And you realize now that because the banks, they loan money to each other, right? There is a sort of entire network of connections. And so when one bank fails within this network, then this failure can actually propagate, like cascade to the network. Well, I mean, this is again this is again a network, right? This is a public transportation map, but think about even like sort of Moscow subway or any other map, any other transportation map. It is a network again, and so the properties that we're going to use, and the things that we're going to learn about networks, methodology we're going to use can be applied to transportation networks. Like, for example, finding the most central nodes, finding the busiest nodes or busiest links within the network. This is actually pretty cool picture. This is from bike sharing in London. So London, like Moscow now, like many other cities, have bike sharing programs. So you can pick up bikes in one location, drop it in another location. And so this shows just different locations in London, and the edges shows where bikes sort of moved around. Very different example from biology now. This is actually yeast protein interaction network. So every node here is a protein. Every edge is interaction between those proteins. So notice that we talked about like networks from finance, from technology, from citations, social networks, biological networks. These are all networks, right? And sometimes by looking at the network, you cannot even tell what type of network it is, right? So it's so abstract. And so the properties of the networks are quite universal, independent from where the network's coming from. Oh, and this one, it's one of the very, very famous images of the internet traffic routing. In this slide, every node is a router, and edge is a connection between those routers. And of course, the view is zoomed out, so supposedly we're seeing the entire internet. And of course, when you start zooming in, you'll see more and more details. Again, very, very, very nice visualization. When you start doing visualization yourself, you realize that it's not easy to make such a picture. And the famous picture from Facebook, right, where there's a friendship across the world. Again, the graph, like it's 500 million people. So if you're interested in the ideas on the networks, right, about the networks, there's a great website, it's called Visual Complexity, that collects examples of different network done by different people and various visualization. And the greatest thing about this website, it also gives you links to the author website. And so you can actually go quite often, get the data, and you can look at the visualization and sort of learn from them. Okay, so that was just a set of examples, right? Just a bunch of examples. And I guess, so what would be the conclusion here? Well, the few things I want to mention that, first of all, this networks, they're not regular, right? They're not just sort of grid, but they're obviously not completely random. There is some structure in there, right? And it's very non-trivial. Non-trivial means, the way things are connected, it's not easy to describe. It's not easy to give you a simple formula that would describe your connectivity pattern, right? You also notice that all those networks that were coming from very, very different fields, whether it's, biology or technological networks, transportation network, social network, they all look quite similar, and there are certain universal properties that they possess. And that actually, the fact that there is this universal properties allows us to form network science as a science, right? So studying and learning about universal properties of the graphs, right? Networks are everywhere, and networks are actually very complex systems. And complex system means the following. It means that if you take the system and cut it into pieces, right, and you start studying each and every piece, it's not going to help you in understanding of the behavior of the system, right? So this reductionism does not work. In some sense, it's like, yes, learning about sort of molecules and learning about individual cells help you a little bit in understanding, say, human life, but it does not help us a lot in understanding, like in general, how human body works, right? Overall, because human body is a complex system. The similar here, pulling out every node and decomposing network into pieces is not going to help you in understanding how network operates. So you need to have this holistic study. You need to look at the network in its entirety, right? And so that's sort of why complex system is difficult to study, because you need to look at it as a whole, right? Cutting it into pieces do not help a lot. So that was a brief introduction into the sort of complex system world, right? And now we're going to jump into sort of materials of the lecture, right? Into like sort of real network science piece. Before we go there, any questions? And by some reason, guys, I don't see you anymore. Okay, we're still there. Good. And I cannot hear you. Leonid, say something. I think your microphone is off.
Do you hear me?
Okay, now I hear you.
Okay. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand and I will give you my call.
All right, okay, no questions. I'll just continue and see how it works. All right, guys. So speaking about this networks, right? As we just discussed, they have quite universal properties. Doesn't matter whether it is biological networks or social networks or any other type of networks. And there are several properties of those networks, like statistical properties, that are very, very fundamental. And we're going to pay a lot of attention to those properties. So the first one is what's called node degree distribution. That is a base power law. And we're going to talk in a few minutes what that is. The second property is what's called small diameter, or a small world network. And all of those networks are small world networks. And the third property is what's called high clustering coefficient, or transitivity. So within the next half an hour, we're going to talk about these three main properties. And through the rest of the course, we'll be coming back to those properties over and over again. And honestly, at the end of this lecture, I would like you to remember those three things, right? So these three properties, these are sort of the key to complex networks. And sort of this is what I want you to remember from today's lecture, okay? So first of all, power law. The quantity of interest, the quantity that we're going to be looking at, is a frequency of the distribution of node degrees. Now, since I can see the class now, how many of you actually understand what this means, what this phrase means? Can you raise your hands, those who actually understand what this means? All right. Those who are not sure. Okay, come on. Okay, so let's try to put it in plain English or plain Russian. And I hope you can see this slide on the right. If not, I'm gonna be describing it. This is actually a good example that will help you understand things. What are you supposed to see on the right here, is a bunch of, it's US, right? And a bunch of cities, and there is a road map, right? It's a map of major US highways connecting the cities. And so what it shows that there are typically several roads coming into each and every city, right? And so if you think about this roadmap as a network, and the city is a node, and the number of freeways coming into the city is the number of links, right? Then what we can do is we can just calculate how many cities has how many freeways coming into it, right? So there is a city here, like with 2 freeways coming into it, and LA here, 2 freeways coming into it. Chicago has like 6 freeways coming into it. Boston, probably 2 or 3. Here is, I don't even know what it is, but like 4 freeways. So you can calculate for every city how many freeways coming into it. And what you realize, if you actually build a histogram, we just count how many cities has how many freeways, you realize that it looks like a Poisson distribution, which means on average, most of the cities will have, let's say, 4 freeways coming into it, and some of the cities will have a little bit less, and some of the cities have a little bit more freeways coming in. And the Poisson distribution, we see it every day in our life. If for example, right now, we decide to ask each of you about your height, and then build a histogram of heights of students in the class, it most likely will be Poisson distribution with average height of, I don't know what it would be, like 165 or 170, right? And then there's some people shorter and some people taller. And I'm pretty sure we'll not have anybody less than like a meter tall and higher than 2 meters. And so that's sort of the Poisson distribution. What we see here at the bottom of the page, that looks a little bit different. This is actually airline. This is the way plane fly. This is air map of the country, where you see major airports and flight routes connecting them. Now, if you're a frequent flyer, you know that within the sort of airline world operates on this what's called hub and spokes model, where there are major hubs that a lot of airlines coming into, and then there is sort of local routes from those major hubs. And say in the US, it's Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Atlanta, that are major hubs that have disproportionately large number of airlines coming into it. And there are a lot of other cities where just sort of a few airline routes coming into those cities. And so if I draw the same picture as we did for Poisson distribution, where I count number of links on the horizontal axis, so number of connections per city, number of airline routes coming to the city. And on the vertical axis, we'll see how many of those cities are. We'll see that there are a few cities with a lot of connections. Again, those hubs, Chicago, LA, New York, Atlanta. But the majority of the cities have very few connections. The majority of the cities is actually very small. In fact, if you plot, not even that, if you plot just the population of the cities, it will follow the same property of a few cities being very large and a lot of being very small. Mathematically speaking, this curve obeys what's called power law, and it can be described by the function 1 over k to certain power. So 1 over k squared, 1 over k cubed, etc. And so it's power law because this is, it's k to the power. So for example, this most likely picture is 1 over k cubed, where k is a number of direct connections, number of routes coming into the city. So what it says, that the number of nodes, the number of cities with connections, with a lot of connections, decreases very fast. Now, the reason we're talking about this is because social networks are organized exactly the same way. Within the social network, there are a few people who have a lot of friends, but majority of the people have very few friends. If you think about Twitter, there are celebrities who have a lot of followers, but there are not that many of those celebrities. Majority of the people have very little followers. And so if I calculate how many people have a few followers, there will be a lot of those guys. And if I calculate how many people have very many followers, there'll be just a few of those. And so that's sort of what this says, right? K is the number of friends. So the number of people with a lot of friends will be small. Let's say if K equal, I don't know, 100, then the probability of you having friends will be 1 over 100 to the third. And if you have, 2 friends, there are going to be a lot of people like that. We're going to be returning to this discussion many, many times in the future lectures, and we'll actually ask you to calculate those distributions, I think, in the next lecture. Today it's an introduction, but what I would like you to have is a sort of, feeling of what power law is about. It's the fact that, within a social network, again, there are very few people with a lot of connections, and majority of people have very few connections. In fact, this power law is the same as, Pareto law. How many of you heard about this Pareto law? Right, so it's the story that 80%, 80-20, for example, story, right? 80%, 20%, 20% of the people have 80% of values in the world, right? So that's the same story, and we're going to be seeing it a lot. This is an example of history of philosophy graph. So where we have every node is a philosopher, and the size of the nodes tells us how many followers he had in terms of sort of his philosophical studies. And the key to this picture is notice that there are a lot of philosophers out there, right? So there's like sort of universe of philosophers, and the size of the node is proportional to the number of followers. As a result, we actually see only a few philosophers here. You can sort of notice as a big node. Again, I don't know if you can read it well on the big screen, but here is Aristotle, here is Nietzsche, here's Karl Marx, Kant, but that's sort of about it, right? In fact, there are very, very many philosophers out there, but only few of them have a lot of followers. And so this is a typical example of this power law network, where there are few nodes with a lot of connections, but the majority of the nodes have very little connection, very few connections. And sort of this is zoom in, so you can see this, right? Again, majority of the nodes are small, they have few connections, but several nodes are large with a lot of connections. That's a signature of the power law. Make sense? Okay. So the next story is about this triads, right? And in fact, this goes like very much to sociology. Oh, and by the way, the story with power law, that's sort of brought in by physicists, right? So they like to look at the statistics and distribution. This story about triads, this comes from sociologists, and in fact, one of the famous papers from Mark Granovetter, The Strength of Weak Ties. And the idea he came up with is the following, that in social relations, in social world, we rarely see this type of combinations if this A, B, and C are people. In fact, he was saying that this is even what's called forbidden triad. So what he is saying is the following. So if A knows C and B knows, so if C knows A and B knows A, then there is a very, very high chance, very high probability that B knows C. And if you think about your own social network, you realize that you have quite a few friends that know each other, right? And the reason that happens is because, if you know two people, there is a good chance, you'll either end up in the same place together, right? And then they will meet, or somehow, they get introduced through you. And so what Granotter was saying, that in social networks, in social interactions, there exists a lot of triangles. And so he would even calling it forbidden triad, the situation when you have three nodes, and there is no sort of closure. It's called triadic closure when the things are closed. And so the key statement here is, if you look at the social networks, they do have a lot of triangles. Okay. It's also called the transitivity, this property, the fact that you have a lot of triangles, it's also called transitivity. And then people talk about high transitivity, and that means, again, a lot of triangles. And transitivity here, from mathematical sort of notion of transitivity, means if C knows A and B knows A, right, then B knows C, the sort of transitivity property. Now, sometimes in the literature, you will also see this is being called high clustering coefficient. We'll define clustering coefficient later in the lectures. But again, the point is triangles. Just social networks, social relations have a lot of triangles in them. This is an example from Facebook. Again, very nice short visualization on a friendship. In this case, the authors actually looked at just friendship for one person, and then sort of maintained relationships, meaning that, it's not just sort of friend within Facebook, but there is also sort of interaction, right? So, you send back and forth messages. And, if you look closely here, you realize, yes, there's a lot of, there are triangles everywhere, right? Triangles, 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 triangles. And of course, with this person, this is a triangle, right? And there's another triangle. And I mean, it's all triangles. When you have time, think about your friends. How many of them actually know each other? You'll be surprised to see, to learn that number, right? And I mean, we'll try later on in one of the exercises to, we'll ask you to look at your social network and, just count those numbers. Oh, by the way, how many of you have a profile on Facebook? All right, ВКонтакте. Okay, so you'll have material to work with. So final story. So the first story was about this power law distribution, which means majority of the nodes have very few connections. If few nodes have a lot of connections. So the second story was about this triangle. So the third important story is about the sort of 6 degrees of separation, right? Or the small world. And I'm sure you heard this, that the people in the world are separated by 6 handshakes, right? So in 6 steps, you can connect to anybody. The funny thing is that this idea was put forward for the first time, by one of the actually Hungarian authors, Frigyes Karinti, in his short story. And then it made into a play, it made into a Hollywood movie. And so when people start studying social networks and they realize it's a small world, they also start, named it 6 degrees of separation, right? But the actual study of this phenomenon has been done by Harvard social psychologist Stanley Milgram. And he even published a paper that he called the small world problem, and experimental study of the small world, right? So again, if you look at this, you'll be, it's 1970s, right? So it's more than 40 years ago when they did it. Actually, that was an amazing experiment. So what he did is he recruited volunteers through the newspaper by publishing, advertising, and giving the following sort of request for the people who participate in the experiment. You can read through this, but I'll just sort of show it on the map. So he pretty much was looking for volunteers that will help him to send a message to a particular person. But the trick was you cannot send the message directly to the person. And it was a letter, right? You cannot send the letter directly to the person. The address is not given, but you can forward it to any of the people you know by name who you think might be sort of closer to that person in whatever sense you believe. So the goal is to actually deliver this letter to the particular person without having his address, literally. So that, if that happens, then, you can trace the chain of the hands that the people who send in the letter to each other until it actually reaches the target. And so what he did is he selected, since he was himself from Harvard, so he selected a target here, within the Boston area. And then he found volunteers in Nebraska, which is right there, right? And some volunteers in Boston. And so the information he gave to the volunteers was, I believe, the person's profession and I think his name, but sort of no address, right? So I mean, there was an address, but you could not sort of use it. So it was just sort of the fact that it's Boston, right? And amazingly, the experiment actually worked. The person received, the target eventually received letters, right? So 30% of the letters that has been sent out by volunteers actually reached the target. So again, the experiment was, the volunteer is given a note, and the question is to deliver this note to a person, but not directly, since you don't know this person, but through some intermediate people, and you do not really know the chain. You just think, okay, who can I send it who might know this person? And 64 letters out of those, more than 200 actually reached the target. And there was when those letters were given one to another, I mean, one person to another, there was a ledger in there, and of course people sort of put a note who the letter went through, right? And so eventually the researchers knew the length, so the number of steps, how many intermediate people the letter went through. And what you see here is this number of intermediates, so how many people the letter went through. And on the vertical axis, just the number of chains, right? So how many of those sort of chains of events. And if you look at this graph, yeah, you will realize, well, first of all, there are two peaks here, right? It means majority of the letters were delivered either in 4 steps or in 6 steps, right? And so there are also differences, of course, from Boston and from Nebraska. But the interesting part was that some people started thinking like, okay, I want to send it to somebody in Boston. Let's see if I know somebody who lives closer to Boston, right? And some people were thinking, because the occupation of the person was given, a stockbroker, do I know anybody from that profession who might know somebody who might know this person, right? And so there was these 2 channels, one through this hometown, right? And the other one is through the business contacts. And that's why we got sort of 2 peaks here. But on average, chain length was 5. And that was actually an amazing experiment. That's why it was called the small world experiment. Took a random person, another random person, and we're able to connect them through 5 steps. And of course, it was like long before internet or anything else. So a very, very, very famous experiment. Of course, today, looking at this, you'll say, okay, statistics is not enough, and there are other things that have been violated. But it really gave this idea of the small size of the world we live in. And of course, since the invention of internet, there have been a lot of attempts to reproduce these experiments. Now, the funny thing is, guys tried to do it with email not long ago, like some of the researchers they actually failed because people don't forward emails. They think it's a spam, right? Even if you write there, it's a research, please forward it to somebody, people just typically just delete it, right? Nevertheless, there were several experiments, and as I mentioned, there was experiment with email graph, and there was 48,000 standards, and it gave us the value of 6. There was experiment with messenger graph, right? So if you have a messenger, or then you actually know who's connected to who, right? How messages are going, and you can actually measure on the average the number of steps between people. And of course, there is a Facebook, right? And in Facebook, there is a graph, there is a friendship graph, and so you can just literally calculate the distance between any two randomly selected people, and then say average it out. I think and this is results you can see here at the bottom, results for the sort of Facebook. It goes back to 2012. Now it's of course some different numbers, but you realize that of course within the U.S. on average there will be a shorter distance than within the entire world. But what's interesting is of course the fact that diameter or average distance among people in Facebook, for example, is shrinking. Notice the green here is 2008, and the blue is 2011, right? But if you think about it, what happens is you get a lot of people now, they're forming more and more connections, new people constantly added to Facebook. So there are sort of new pathways that appear between people that are already on Facebook, right? And so the diameter is actually shrinking. An average pathway shrinking. So, according to Facebook 2012, there were like on average 4.7 steps between, people. Now, Facebook in 2012 was 700 million users. How many users are now in Facebook? Do you know? Yeah, more than a billion, right? So I would expect that this average diameter actually shrink now even more. So we're not 6 degrees of separation, not 5 degrees of separation, but even less. So which really it's actually fascinating. That's in 4 steps you pretty much can connect to anybody in the world. Now there is a very, very trivial and simple model for this, which is wrong in a sense. It just violates a lot of assumptions, but it gives you an idea that this is in fact possible. Now imagine that this is you in the center, right? And let's say you have 100 friends. I don't know. And each of your friends have 100 friends, and so on. Now, we know that in real life, and we talked about this, about triangles, so they do overlap. So you cannot make assumption that I'm making here on this slide. But for a second, just to make it simple, let's assume that they do not overlap. So, you have 100 friends, and neither of them know each other, and each of them have 100 friends, neither of them know each other, etc. And let's see how far this goes, like in terms of in how many steps you will cover everybody. This is a very simple picture here. Let's say it's you in the center, you have 4 friends, right? And each of those friends have 4 friends, and so on, right? This is sort of trivial. So, you know 4 people, each of them know 4 people, so 16, each of them know 4 people, so 64, etc., 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 right? So, if we estimate, we just want to estimate that if this is if you have, say, 4 friends, then after 2 steps, it's going to be 4 squared 16 connections, right? After 3 steps, it's 4 to the 3rd power. After 4 steps, it's 4 to the 4th power, etc., etc. So Z is the number of friends, D is the number of steps, and is the total number of people you're reaching in these steps. And that sort of formula describes this picture. Well, then you can actually easily calculate D as logarithm of n divided by logarithm of Z, right? So if n population of the world, which is 6.7 billion, and let's say on average you have 50 friends, then D going to be 5.8. So if the world was organized exactly like this, it's a trivial answer that in, 5.8 or like 6 steps, you know everybody. Of course, world is not like that. Of course, there's like, the friends will overlap, but this shows you the power of this exponential growth, right? So if you take, 50 and put it into the 6th power, you get, 7 billion, which is a lot. So this is a very simple model. We're going to look later on into a little bit more complicated models of how networks are arranged and try to map them into the real world. That's pretty much it for today, right? This was a sort of introductory story. Again, there are 3 things I want you to remember. So one thing is that, well, actually 4 things, right? The first thing is that, the networks we're going to talk about, they're complex, they're complicated. They are coming from very, very different fields of study, but they do possess universal properties. And second, third, and fourth, right? There is 3 major properties that all those networks have in terms of like statistics. So one property is there what's called power law networks, which means in these networks, there are a few nodes that have, very high degree or a lot of friends, right? Celebrities, but the majority have very few friends. Second is that there are a lot of triangles social networks. So, friends, your 2 friends most likely know each other. And third, that we do live in a small world, and that 5-6 degrees of separation connects everybody in if we look at the Facebook. But interestingly enough, any other network, whether it is sort of biological networks or economic networks or technological networks, that those networks also have a small diameter. So it takes only a few steps to get from one sort of end of the network to another end of the network, right? So go through the entire network. And these are 3 sort of major properties of the networks. And we're going to discuss more and look at some models that predict these properties and explain those properties of the networks. Now, here's a few references. I'll try it at the end of every lecture, give you some references. If you're into this, go get those papers online, read them. They're good. And there's some sort of original papers. So these are review papers. This is actually a very interesting paper by Albert Barabacha, Introduction to Scale-Free Networks. And this is original paper by Stanley Milgram on his small world phenomenon. And this is experimental study that was done here. And this is a paper on a Facebook if you want to read something sort of fresh, more fresh. That's it with the lecture. I know it's very difficult to ask questions right now, but Andrej is there. So if you have questions for me right now, I can still try to answer them. Yes, please. Okay, I cannot hear that. I cannot hear that. Can you please either come to the microphone or?
So the question was about how to translate power law in Russian. So that's.
Oh, степенной закон распределения.
Thank you. Okay, ask questions.
And the other question is.
You can ask about microphone. One moment. One moment.
The other question is that what does it mean forbidden triads? I understood the idea that when people know each other, then when one person knows 2 other persons, those 2 have high probability of knowing each other. I understood, but what is the meaning of forbidden? Why is forbidden?
Right. So okay. Like first of all, let's remember that paper comes from sociologists, right? So like for mathematician, forbidden means it never happens, right? For sociologists, it might mean something very, very different, much softer meaning. What he was trying to say is that it is very rarely that if you have one person connected to another and there is another friend, sort of they're connected, that those 2 people will not know each other. And so that he meant by forbidden, he meant that like rarely happens in social structure. There is no like physical law that doesn't allow it.
Well, it's usually the case that if you have two friends that they know each other in social network.
So it's not rarely happens. It's not rarely, it frequently happens.
Well, in fact, yes. In social networks, it's frequentification, but in some other networks, it may. There are some other examples when it is not.
All right, guys.
Okay, if no questions, then let's have a break, 10 minutes, and after that we'll start classes. So feel free to come. There is no dinner room right now because it works till 6 p.m. So you should get back. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Pleasure.